Recognizing agency on an international scale also requires humility from the global community. It requires listening without judgment, learning without assuming superiority, and acting in solidarity rather than charity. It asks us to question our assumptions about who has knowledge, who holds power, and what it means to be a partner in justice. Only by centering the agency of those most affected can international efforts move beyond temporary fixes to foster sustainable, just, and inclusive futures. In the end, empowerment is not a favor. It is a right. It is the foundation for healing the wounds inflicted by international harm, and for building a world where all people can live with dignity, freedom, and hope. By honoring and amplifying agency, we open the door to true transformation, one where the harmed are no longer just survivors, but leaders, visionaries, and architects of a more just global community. They are how dignity is restored to those whom history has tried to erase. Museums, textbooks, films, public monuments, and national curriculums must all be revisited and revised with justice as the compass. Not pride, not convenience, and not fear. To heal from international harm, the world must become a better steward of memory. Not just to commemorate what has happened, but to learn, to grow, and to prevent its forgetting is easy. It allows people to look away, to move on, to tell themselves that the past is over. But forgetting is a luxury the harmed cannot afford. For them, the past is not past, it is present. In poverty, in displacement, in inherited trauma, and in systems still rigged against them. To remember is to honor their truth. To remember is to make it harder for history to be rewritten by those who caused the suffering. The international community cannot afford selective memory. We must remember not only the Holocaust, but the Rwandan genocide. Not only 9/11, but the invasions that followed. Not only world wars, but the proxy wars that devastated the global South. We must remember the slave ships and the stolen lands, the coups orchestrated from afar, the treaties broken, and the resources looted. We must remember the silencing of indigenous languages, the erasure of African histories, the suppression of women's voices, and the criminalization of resistance movements. Memory is resistance. It is power. It is survival. But memory must not only be preserved, it must be reclaimed. Communities that have been marginalized and oppressed must be allowed and supported to tell their own histories. Oral traditions, ancestral knowledge, archival recovery, and storytelling are not just cultural practices. They are political acts. They are how the truth pushes back against official lies. Economic inequality and social hierarchies to this day. And yet there is a global tendency, particularly among powerful nations, to bury those truths under narratives of patriotism, heroism, and progress. This manipulation of memory creates a global society where harm is repeated precisely because its roots are denied. When nations fail to teach the full story of their histories, they prepare the ground for more harm. They teach new generations to see only their country's victimhood, never its complicity. They glorify conquest without naming its cost. They celebrate independence while erasing the people who were displaced or destroyed to make it possible. This incomplete memory becomes policy, ideology, and public belief. It becomes the justification for everything, from military interventions to economic exploitation. Without the full memory of what has happened, how can people recognize when history is being repeated? One of the most overlooked yet profoundly damaging aspects of international harm is the erasure of memory, the systematic forgetting of what has been done, to whom, and by whom. This erasure is not a passive loss. It is a deliberate act carried out through sanitized history books, biased narratives, media silence, and institutional amnesia. When memory is erased, so is accountability. So is the truth. And so is the possibility of real justice. History, when told honestly, becomes a mirror. It forces us to confront not only the triumphs of human progress, but also the brutality, greed, and violence that made much of that progress possible. Colonialism, slavery, land dispossession, forced migration, and cultural genocide are not ancient crimes buried in the past. They are legacies that continue to shape international relations. Consumers have a role to play in questioning how their products are made and at what cost. Educators have a duty to teach history with honesty and empathy. Everyone, regardless of nationality, has the ability to perpetuate harm through silence or disrupt it through informed action. The failure to hold the powerful accountable creates a culture where harm is not only permitted, but incentivized. It tells future generations that the game is rigged, that justice is optional, and that power is its own justification. This cannot stand. If we want a future where human dignity is respected, where peace is more than a slogan, and where nations truly relate to one another as equals, we must build a global culture of accountability. One where consequences are real, reparations are made, and the truth is not buried, but upheld. But accountability is not just about international courts or high-level politics. It starts with local voices being able to speak the truth without fear. It starts with community organizers being able to demand redress when a corporation poisons their water. It starts with journalists being protected when they expose corruption. It starts with survivors of war, colonization, and systemic abuse being allowed to name what happened and receive more than empty apologies. When we talk about accountability, we must also talk about repair, because justice is hollow without restoration. Accountability must be systemic, but it must also be personal. Citizens of nations that cause harm abroad have a responsibility to speak up, vote ethically, challenge harmful narratives, and demand transparency from their governments. Military powers can invade, occupy, or bomb, and years later walk away without reparations, without trials, and without even a public reckoning. This uneven landscape of justice is itself a form of harm, because it sends a clear message. Some lives matter more than others, and some crimes will never be punished if committed by the powerful. True accountability means dismantling this double standard. It means creating legal and moral systems that apply the same standards of justice to all, regardless of wealth or geopolitical status. It means reforming institutions like the United Nations, the International Criminal Court, and the World Trade Organization, so that they reflect the voices and values of all nations, not just a privileged few. It means ensuring that international law is not just a tool of punishment for the weak, but a shield of protection for everyone, especially those who are most vulnerable. At the heart of every lasting solution to international harm lies the commitment to accountability. Real, enforceable, and universal accountability. Without it, justice becomes a performance. Power remains unchecked, and history continues to repeat itself under new disguises. Accountability is not just about assigning blame. It is about building systems where consequences follow actions, where harm cannot be hidden behind borders or bureaucracy, and where no entity, no matter how large, wealthy, or influential, is above scrutiny. For far too long, international institutions have operated under a selective lens of justice. Nations and leaders from the global south are often subject to intense investigation and condemnation, while more powerful states evade responsibility entirely. Corporations that destroy ecosystems or exploit vulnerable labor in one region are protected by weak legal frameworks and transnational loopholes. It must shape the policies we demand from our leaders and the accountability we require from global institutions. It must become a lens through which we evaluate justice, not just for ourselves, but for those who have been pushed to the edges of international concern. Empathy may not stop every injustice, but its absence ensures that injustice continues. It is not enough to analyze the structures of harm. We must also feel the weight of those harms and let that feeling move us. Empathy is what keeps our politics human. It is what makes solidarity possible. And in a world that is increasingly desensitized to violence and inequality, it may be the most radical tool we have left. Education, storytelling, and direct exposure to different cultures and experiences are some of the most powerful tools we have to build empathy. When children are taught global history not just through the lens of conquest and power, but through the voices of those who resisted, endured, and rebuilt, they begin to see the world differently. When artists, filmmakers, and writers share authentic narratives from marginalized communities, they invite audiences into lives that are otherwise rendered invisible. And when people have the courage to tell their own stories, raw, unfiltered, and painful, they challenge the world to care in a way that numbers and reports never could. But empathy must also move beyond emotion into action. It must inform how we vote, what we consume, who we listen to, and how we show up in moments of global crisis. Empathy interrupts the narrative of us versus them. It dissolves the myth that suffering only matters when it happens close to home. In a world fractured by geopolitical interest, racial hierarchies, and economic divides, empathy is what restores the human connection that policies often try to erase. International harm thrives on the ability of decision makers to separate themselves from the consequences of their actions. It allows politicians to bomb cities they've never visited. It enables CEOs to profit from sweatshops they'll never walk through. It allows voters to support laws that devastate distant populations without understanding what that devastation looks or feels like. But when empathy is reintroduced into the equation, the distance shrinks. It becomes harder to approve of suffering when you've listened to the voice of someone who has lived through it. It becomes harder to ignore injustice when you've truly understood the cost it imposes on real lives. At the core of every international harm, whether it comes in the form of war, economic exploitation, cultural erasure, or media distortion, is a profound lack of empathy. This absence is not accidental. It is cultivated, sustained, and weaponized by systems that rely on detachment to justify violence. Without empathy, It becomes easy to make decisions that destroy communities from a distance. Without empathy, policies that cause starvation, displacement, and despair can be written with sterile language and pass with unanimous approval. Without empathy, humanity becomes negotiable, something to be weighed against profit, power, or convenience. Empathy is not weakness. It is not a luxury or an emotional indulgence. It is a critical force for justice. It is what allows us to see others not as statistics, borders, or burdens, but as people with lives, dreams, and histories as real and complex as our own. The momentum for change stalls, and those who suffer are left not only with the pain of their reality, but with the added burden of being unseen. Their cries echo into a silence that has been rehearsed by centuries of disregard. But harm should never feel normal. It should never be routine. It should never become acceptable just because it is widespread. The process of denormalizing international harm begins with reclaiming our ability to be disturbed by it, to let it break our comfort, to let it question our assumptions, to let it stir us into action. Only by naming what the world has grown used to can we begin to undo it. Only by refusing to be numb can we begin to restore what has been damaged, neglected, or erased. The same pattern appears in international policy. Harm that violates the dignity of millions can continue for decades under the banner of foreign policy, development, or national interest. Displacement of entire communities may be written off as an unfortunate side effect. Exploitative labor may be accepted as part of the global supply chain. Environmental destruction may be justified in the name of economic growth. The language of diplomacy and business can cloak injustice so effectively that even when people do see the harm, they struggle to name it, and even more, to stop it. What makes normalization so dangerous is that it lowers the standard of what the world is willing to tolerate. Each new violation becomes just a statistic. Each injustice becomes just another part of a tired pattern. The urgency fades. Why are certain countries trapped in debt while others grow richer on the profits of their suffering? Why are certain voices excluded from international negotiations that directly affect their futures? Why do disasters in some parts of the world receive immediate global attention and aid while others are ignored entirely? When harm is normalized, these questions stop being asked. In their place, apathy settles in like dust. Apathy. When they work in the background, why should they be minimized or simply eliminated? When harm is normalized, these questions stop being asked. In their place, apathy settles in like dust. Media plays a powerful role in this normalization. When coverage of conflict, poverty, or oppression is stripped of context, repeated endlessly without solutions, or presented with a sense of inevitability, it shapes public consciousness. It teaches audiences not to be outraged, but to be numb. It turns stories of real people into background noise. The normalization of suffering through media is not a passive error. It is often a reflection of deeper biases about which lives are considered newsworthy and which are not. One of the most dangerous aspects of international harm is how easily it becomes invisible over time, not because it disappears, but because it is absorbed into the normal routines of global politics, media coverage, and economic systems. Normalization is a quiet killer. It makes people indifferent to suffering that does not directly touch them. It builds a wall between the comfortable and the oppressed, between those who benefit from the system and those who are broken by it. The more this harm is repeated without accountability, the more it begins to feel ordinary and the more difficult it becomes to challenge. We begin to accept the idea that some nations are always poor, some people are always displaced, and some regions are permanently unstable. These are not natural conditions. They are consequences of historical and ongoing decisions made by those in power. Yet over time, the world forgets to ask why. Speaking out also means breaking out of fear, fear of retaliation, fear of being misunderstood, fear of standing alone. It means understanding that silence, while sometimes necessary for safety, can also be a form of complicity. Raising one's voice doesn't always mean shouting. Sometimes it means writing. Sometimes it means organizing. Sometimes it means simply refusing to repeat lies. But no matter the form it takes, every act of speech against injustice is a disruption of the narrative that those in power try to control. Global injustice thrives on invisibility. It needs people to believe they are alone, that their pain is too small to matter, or that resistance is futile. But every time someone speaks, truly speaks, about their pain, their story, their truth, they tear a hole in that illusion. And through that hole, others begin to see, to question, to connect, and eventually to rise. When indigenous leaders in the Amazon raise alarms about deforestation, and when journalists in exile continue to publish the truth about regimes that force them to flee, they are all contributing to a global resistance. They are building a chorus of voices that cannot be confined to any one place or silenced by any one power. Technology has made this solidarity of voice more possible than ever before. Social media, independent journalism, podcasts, digital storytelling, and transnational coalitions allow stories to move beyond the limits of mainstream coverage. They allow local truths to gain global traction. A single video, a poem, a live-streamed protest. These can all travel the world in minutes, disrupting dominant narratives and exposing realities that institutions prefer to hide. But with that opportunity comes responsibility. The responsibility to listen, to amplify, and to protect those who speak out. Because being visible also makes them vulnerable. Voices must rise not just in reaction to crisis, but as a continuous, intentional force that demands to be heard even when it is inconvenient, controversial, or disruptive to the status quo. When communities speak out against exploitation, colonization, forced migration, environmental destruction, and cultural erasure, they are not simply complaining, they are asserting their right to exist with dignity. Too often, people are made to feel that their voices are small, local, or irrelevant in the global conversation. This is by design. Systems of oppression flourish when people feel isolated, powerless, and unheard. But the truth is, every voice matters, especially when it is part of a collective echo that refuses to die out. When farmers in India protest corporate land grabs, when students in Nigeria speak out against corruption, in a world where international harm is so often normalized, minimized, or buried under layers of political jargon and media distortion, the importance of raising voices that transcend borders cannot be overstated. Speaking out is not just an act of resistance, it is an act of survival. It is how truth reclaims its ground in spaces where deception has been institutionalized. When people raise their voices against injustice, especially across national, linguistic, and cultural divides, they challenge the very systems that rely on silence and fragmentation to maintain control. The first step to changing the international landscape of injustice is to tell the truth about it, and truth-telling requires courage, especially when the platforms for communication are controlled by those who benefit from the current order. They show us that solidarity is not built in conference rooms, but in the streets, in the fields, in classrooms, in refugee camps, and online. They remind us that global justice does not trickle down from the powerful. It rises up from the people. And it must be protected, because those who work for justice often become targets themselves, facing repression, imprisonment, and even death for daring to speak truth to power. What gives solidarity its strength is not sameness but shared values. It is not about pretending our histories or realities are identical, but about recognizing that our liberation is interconnected. When one nation is exploited, the ripple effects are felt everywhere. When one voice is silenced, it becomes easier to silence the next. In the same way, when one community rises, it creates momentum for others to rise too. Global justice begins with the realization that the boundaries drawn on maps are political, but the struggle for human dignity knows no borders. Solidarity and justice are especially vital in a world where global decision-making is still dominated by a few nations. Institutions like the United Nations, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund were built on ideals of equality and cooperation, but in practice their leadership and policies often reflect the interests of the powerful. Countries in the global south frequently find themselves subject to decisions they had little power to influence. For global solidarity to be real, those power imbalances must be challenged. Justice demands a seat at the table for all, not just in theory, but in practice. The role of civil society is also central in building this solidarity. Grassroots movements, indigenous communities, labor unions, student activists, environmental defenders, and countless others are already connected through shared purpose, if not shared language. They are not facing two separate injustices. They are facing the same global structure, just in different forms. Solidarity means understanding that harm is not isolated by geography. It flows across borders, and so must our resistance. Justice, in the international context, is not merely about punishing wrongdoing. It is about restoring dignity, redistributing power, and rewriting the rules that have allowed harm to flourish. True justice acknowledges historical theft of land, labor, culture, and opportunity, and works not just to recognize it, but to repair it. This means more than symbolic apologies. It means concrete action, debt relief, fair trade agreements, the return of stolen artifacts, open access to medicine and technology, and a shift in whose voices are allowed to shape international policy. In the face of widespread international harm, the only true path to resistance and repair lies in global solidarity and justice. No single nation, group, or individual can undo the vast systems of exploitation and inequality that have been built over generations. But when voices unite across borders, when movements connect across languages and time zones, and when people refuse to be divided by race, class, nationality, or religion, real change becomes possible. Solidarity is not just a moral stance, it is a strategic necessity. It is how the marginalized become visible, how the silenced are heard, and how the powerless reclaim their power. Global solidarity begins with recognition. The ability to see that your struggle and someone else's may look different on the surface, but are rooted in the same systems of oppression. When a worker in South America is underpaid by a multinational corporation, and a worker in Southeast Asia suffers under the same company's exploitative practices. The global system is so deeply entrenched that injustice appears legal, inequality appears natural, and silence becomes the cost of survival. Those who speak out, whether they are activists, whistleblowers, or independent journalists, are discredited or silenced. Meanwhile, the powerful continue to write the rules and rewrite the stories to suit their needs. They decide who is heard, who is helped, and who is harmed. This imbalance of power is not a flaw in the system, it is the system. It protects the interests of those at the top, while making it nearly impossible for those at the margins to challenge, resist, or even be seen. International harm, when rooted in institutional power, becomes a cycle that feeds itself. And until that cycle is broken, the same hands that claim to protect justice will continue to suppress it. Corporations are no different, only they operate with even greater stealth. Multinational companies move freely between nations, driven not by ethical standards, but by profit margins. In some countries, they exploit legal loopholes, suppress union organizing, underpay workers, and degrade the environment, all while advertising themselves as partners in development. The damage they leave behind is often irreversible. Polluted rivers, collapsed industries, displaced communities. Depravity, yet when held accountable, they hide behind international trade agreements, complex legal structures, and public relations campaigns. Their reach is global, but their responsibility is nowhere to be found. What's more alarming is how these abuses are normal. These conditions are rarely imposed on wealthy nations. Instead, they are selectively applied, reinforcing a global imbalance where the powerful dictate the terms of growth and the less powerful are forced to comply, regardless of local context or consequences. This is not aid, it is coercion under the guise of assistance. Governments, too, use their influence across borders in ways that hurt rather than help. Through the manipulation of diplomatic channels, visa policies, military alliances, and trade relations, they exert pressure on other nations to conform to their interests. Those that resist are isolated, sanctioned, or portrayed as threats to global stability. Meanwhile, allies who commit violations of international law are shielded from consequences. The rules appear to shift depending on who is playing the game. This selective enforcement undermines the credibility of global norms and punishes those who are simply seeking to protect their sovereignty, culture, or resources. Power is a complex and often dangerous tool, especially when held by institutions, governments, and corporations that operate beyond borders with little accountability. The harm inflicted internationally is not just a matter of accidental overreach. It is frequently a calculated misuse of power. The institutions that were created to preserve peace, encourage development, and ensure justice too often become instruments of dominance, exclusion, and control. Take international financial institutions, for example. Organizations that claim to help developing nations recover from crisis often impose economic conditions that stifle progress rather than support it. Countries are told to cut public spending, privatize essential services, or open their markets to foreign competition, all while their economies are still fragile. Then there's economic harm, often the most measurable and yet the most misrepresented. Trade imbalances, unfair loan agreements, and exploitative labor practices are all forms of harm masked as diplomacy or development. Countries rich in natural resources are often stripped of their wealth while being told they are being helped. Local workers are underpaid by global corporations that claim to be creating jobs. Debt is piled onto countries in the name of economic growth, when in truth, those debts serve to trap rather than empower. And behind it all lies a system that continues to benefit the already powerful at the expense of those with fewer choices. This type of harm is insidious because it rarely causes immediate collapse. Instead, it drains hope, slows growth, and creates a long-term dependency. It turns entire nations into cautionary tales, while protecting the reputations of those doing the harm. It becomes harder for them to see possibility. They begin to question their worth, their identity, and their place in the world. This is psychological harm, a quiet erosion of confidence and dignity caused not by bombs, but by biases. Reputational harm can also be just as devastating. Once a nation or a people are marked as troubled, dangerous, or corrupt, that reputation can follow them indefinitely. International institutions may hesitate to offer assistance, investors may pull away, tourists may avoid visiting, employers may reject applicants with names tied to certain regions. A single damaging story, a manipulated statistic, or a prejudiced documentary can stick in the global imagination, creating an obstacle course for anyone associated with it. And the worst part, often those narratives are shaped without the input or consent of the people being spoken about. They're defined from the outside, then punished for it. When we speak about international harm, many people instinctively think of war, sanctions, or overt aggression. But the most enduring and far-reaching damage often doesn't come from weapons or invasions. It comes from the quiet, consistent forces that shape perception, opportunity, and dignity. Harm across borders is not always physical. In fact, some of the most destructive forms of harm are psychological, reputational, and economic. They are invisible to the eye, but they carve deep wounds into individuals, communities, and nations. Take, for example, the power of narrative. When international media continuously portrays a country as backward, chaotic, or violent, it affects how the world sees its people. But more tragically, it affects how those people see themselves. Generations grow up internalizing stereotypes crafted not by their lived realities, but by headlines written far away. And it's not just governments that play this game. Multinational corporations often act with impunity in poorer nations, extracting resources, paying unfair wages, and polluting environments, all while enjoying legal protections in their own countries. These corporate actions are carefully calculated to exploit weak regulatory systems abroad while maximizing profit. The harm caused is long-term and often irreversible. It affects not just economies, but identities, cultures, and the dignity of entire populations. This kind of harm hides behind bureaucracy, contracts, and public relations statements. It doesn't come with a gun or a missile, yet it destabilizes lives just as profoundly. It is harm by design. It is not emotional impulse or human error. It is deliberate, systemic, and strategic. Once that narrative spreads, it becomes extremely difficult for the targeted country or community to reverse the damage. They become trapped in a cycle of reputational harm, where no matter how much progress they make, their image remains tarnished. The same kind of systemic injury occurs economically. Trade policies may seem neutral on paper, but when they are enforced unequally, when tariffs are weaponized, or when development loans are tied to conditions that benefit the lender more than the borrower, it reveals a deeper pattern. These are not isolated injustices. They are woven into a global system that rewards the powerful and penalizes the vulnerable. International harm is often not the result of a single event or action, but rather the outcome of deeply embedded systems designed to serve particular interests while sidelining or oppressing others. This harm is strategic in nature, it doesn't occur by chance, and it certainly isn't random. Whether through trade agreements, media framing, selective diplomacy, or even the development of international laws, many powerful actors carefully calculate their actions to maintain dominance, protect economic interests, or silence dissenting voices. For example, when a powerful country labels another as unstable, corrupt, or dangerous, it isn't always about truth. It's often about shaping a narrative that justifies interference or exclusion. These labels carry weight on the global stage. They influence how investors, international organizations, and the public perceive entire populations.